Welcome to Strategic Podcast, where we engage with leading thinkers and practitioners shaping the future of global peace, security, and development. Today, we are honored to host a distinguished scholar and policy influencer whose work has profoundly impacted African and global discourses on conflict, governance, and resource politics. Joining us is Dr. Cyril Obi, Program Director of the African Peacebuilding Network and the Next Generation Social Sciences and Africa Program at the Social Science Research Council. With an illustrious career spanning decades, Dr. Obi is a towering figure in African political scholarship. After earning his doctorate from the University of Lagos, he rose to prominence as an associate research professor at the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs and later held the prestigious Claude Eki Visiting Chair at Uppsala University. His intellectual leadership extends across continents, from spearheading critical research at the Nordic Africa Institute to serving as a visiting scholar at Columbia University and an adjunct professor at CUNY. A recipient of numerous fellowships including from Coursera, Oxford, and the SSRC, Dr. Obi's expertise is sought after worldwide. Beyond academia, he shapes policy debates through editorial roles in top-tier journals like African Affairs and Review of African Political Economy, and his co-authored books on China-Africa relations and Niger Delta conflicts are seminal works. A board member of the African Studies Association and the International Panel on Exiting Violence, Dr. Obi bridges theory and practice in tackling Africa's most pressing challenges. Today, we delve into his insights on peacebuilding, the geopolitics of resources, and Africa's evolving security architecture. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you.
And I'm going to proceed to the questions right now. So, how do you interpret the link between natural resources and violent conflict in the Horn of Africa, particularly in places like South Sudan or Eastern Ethiopia?
Thank you very much. I think the first place to start with is to look at what I call the geostrategic importance of the Horn of Africa. When you look at the rich histories of this region, and you look at the fact that the Horn of Africa is strategic both in terms of access to other parts of Africa, the Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea. You begin to understand that this region is very important, also because of its rich natural resources, whether you're talking in terms of water, whether you're talking in terms of forests, and fundamentally whether you're talking in terms of land. And so the relationship between natural resources and conflict is that there is a struggle for access to shrinking natural resources, partly the result of climate change and the fact that the growing population puts pressure on existing resources. Beyond land, you look at the things that the land contains. We're talking of minerals, either solid minerals or minerals like oil and gas. These are sources of immense wealth, both to the people that live on the land and to the various forces that extract those resources. But for you to extract resources, you must have control. And so the struggle for access and control, as well as the distribution of the benefits from those natural resources, is actually what drives conflict. So that is the connection, the struggle or the competition for access to resources, land, water, forests. The consequences of that struggle has implications both in terms of the relationship between states and societies, between local communities, and between the various forces that actually extract and manage those resources. And what you see is that the consequence of that kind of competition, apart from the fact that people are able to benefit, albeit unequally, is that you have internal displacement and refugeeism, which you see are features of what is happening in South Sudan as well as Eastern Ethiopia. So coming back to the basics, that connection is the struggle or competition over natural resources. And you must understand that these natural resources are important because they form the basis of the livelihoods of various peoples, whether you're talking about pastoralist herders or whether you're talking about farmers. They have competing livelihoods over the same natural resources. But at the same time, whether you're talking of large-scale industrial farming or large-scale industrial extraction, it has implication for land use and competition over land.
Well, that is a very articulated answer. And I'm going to proceed to the next question.
Thank you.
Okay. How effective is EGAD as a regional peace-building body? And also, what are its strengths and limitations in managing conflict in the Horn of Africa?
Thank you very much. I think that there are two ways of answering that question. If you realize that when EGAD was set up, it was set up essentially to address problems of drought and desertification and agriculture. But it has grown beyond that original mandate to deal with issues around conflict prevention, conflict resolution, peace and security. That in itself is a success that we cannot underestimate. But when we go beyond its origins and look at its current performance, I would say that it's a mixed bag. There have been successes, but at the same time, there have been shortcomings, some of which are not really the fault of EGAD. But if you want to point at particular successes, you could point to some extent to the peace process in Somalia and the peace process that eventually culminated in the referendum and independence of South Sudan. So, but having said that, you want to look at the structural constraints that have prevented EGAD from fully realizing its mandate. First of all, and this is not peculiar to EGAD, I must say, is a question of institutional weakness. Second would be the problem of resources. As you probably know, peace and security is an expensive business.
Yes.
It costs a lot of money to convene meetings. Mediation is not cheap.
Yes.
And at the same time, when you are dealing with the enhancers and spoilers of peace, it requires a lot of resources, which unfortunately most African regional economic communities do not possess.
Exactly.
And so for that reason, they have to rely on external funding. And external funding comes with its own implications. I don't want to use the word complications. Dependence
On other fundings.
on external countries and organizations for funding comes sometimes with strings.
Yes.
It also provides leverage because, as they say, he who pays the piper dictates the tune. Even if EGAD is not doing exactly what some of these interests want, they do have some considerable leverage. Secondly, you do understand that external funding by various organizations also leads to competing priorities, even though EGAD originally has to have its own institutional priorities. But you do understand that where capacity is not that very strong in some aspects, then it creates the space for some of this interest to percolate and dilute what EGAD wants to do. The third thing is that EGAD has member states, and these member states are not equal. Some of them are, to put it mildly, are rather hegemonic.
Okay.
And so you can think of countries like Ethiopia, You can think of countries like Kenya, you can think of countries like Uganda, and you can think of the smaller, in quote, member states, which tend to not have the same kind of leverage. And so sometimes EGAD finds itself not being able to escape what I call the national interests of some of these hegemonic states, and this turns into a balancing act, which has implications for the capacity of EGAD to implement some of its decisions in relation to peace and security. And it ends up that when it comes to some countries, it's much easier to implement decisions, but when it comes to other countries, they are not able to implement the same decisions. And this you can see in what has played out in South Sudan, where you do have the interesting situation of, as you know, in this region, there are complex crises. And some of these complex crises have to do with intrastate, interstate, and what I call proxy wars. So it operates like saying that if, for example, Ethiopia has a conflict with a neighboring state or has internal conflict, the neighboring states will be interested to support some of the warring factions which are fighting with government. It's what you also see in South Sudan. It's what is playing out in what is now Sudan. So these various dynamics of what I call complex transitions and complex crises tend to complicate the issue further, and this undermines the capacity of EGAD to do its work. So either way, it's about a whole organization being the sum of its parts. And if some of these parts are not cohesive and fit into a unified agenda, then there's very little EGAD can do.
Well, you answered that perfectly. I'm going to proceed to the third question of today.
Thank you.
So, how do you see your agency shaping the security and governance future of the Horn of Africa, especially in the protest-driven transition like Sudan?
Well, I think the first thing which I should have mentioned earlier, is that most of the crises that we face, either in terms of natural resources or in terms of political transitions, is, first of all, we need to generate the capacity to outlive the legacies of colonial structural issues and inequalities. The second thing is that state-society relations has to be addressed. It will appear in many regards that African states tend to be distant from societies, and those living what I would call at the center tend to marginalize and discriminate against those living in the peripheries. So one of the things that has to be done is to bridge that gap between the powerful, centralized decision-making powers, I don't want to use the word states, and the people, so that the people at the margins, at the peripheries, begin to see in the center those things that they want. So inequality is an issue. For the Horn of Africa, that seems to lie at the heart of the problem. That when you are looking at the parts of the region, that issue of completing transitions in a transparent and legitimate and how I will call inclusive and participatory manner is so fundamental to resolving that issue. This region is admittedly one of the richest regions on the continent. Exactly. It has everything it needs in terms of natural resources, in terms of human resources, in terms of a glorious history, a glorious past that is founded not just on issues around faith, but science, technology, and the arts. And so what we have to do is to find a way of bringing more inclusive democracies within countries, addressing issues around ethnic, religious identities that tend to make some people feel alienated and fall into this mindset of the need to always violently contest, because the violence is undermining the potential for growth, peace, and development. Now, if those, what I call the social contract related issues, are addressed within each country and people open up the room or the space for inclusive peace, that actually brings everybody to the table and treats them equally, and the political elites begin to come together to understand that everything cannot be settled at the battlefield, then we will begin a process of healing and reconciliation, which is so important to enabling the various parts of the region to begin a process of, first of all, national reconstruction, justice and reconciliation, and bringing that together within a regional framework that would re-energize, re-empower, and provide EGAD with the momentum to overcome its current structural limitations.
Well, me as a youth myself, I really like the answer. It's very fulfilling. I'm going to proceed to the next question. What lesson from West Africa peace building, such as Niger Delta or post-conflict Liberia, could be applied to Sudan, Somalia, or Ethiopia?
Thank you very much. I think the first thing we need to understand is that we can learn lessons from elsewhere, but you can't import solutions. The solutions to the problems of the Horn lie with the people and the governments of the Horn. What can they learn from West Africa? I think West Africa has what I call model peace and security mechanisms. That's one thing that we can say for West Africa, that ECOWAS was able to build a sophisticated peace and security mechanism, what I call the ECOWAS conflict prevention approach. But even that needs to be updated in the light of the recent developments because of the changing geostrategic trends in West Africa. A lot of those things were designed during the Cold War and immediate post-Cold War time. Now, the engagements that you find in Africa are no longer, it's no longer the same configuration. In the past, you had to deal with the Cold War environment, which was the West versus the East. Now, it's a bit more complicated. The United States is becoming more isolationist, and its commitment to multilateralism is not what it was like in the immediate post-Cold War time. And we now see a much greater presence of middle and emerging powers in Africa. The return of Russia, a coming into place of China, which is massive growth in terms of economic involvement and trade with Africa. We are seeing Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. We are seeing Iran. Now, this has changed dramatically the geopolitical context, even in West Africa. And so, the question is that beyond asking what we can learn from ECOWAS, there is a lot. There was a peacekeeping force, which was really quite successful in returning peace to Liberia and Sierra Leone, and to some extent stabilizing Gambia and Guinea-Bissau and La Côte d'Ivoire. What we see is that, can we have a peacekeeping force for the Horn of Africa? And for the reasons I mentioned earlier, this would be a bit more problematic. So what I think the Horn can learn from West Africa has to do with things around early warning and mediation, as well as what I call the peace and security architecture. But beyond that, the Horn would have to come together to see how it can respond to the fluid dynamics of the changing geopolitical and strategic environment. How do you deal with the new actors that are coming into the Horn, that are coming into the various countries? So yes, there is a lot to learn, but even beyond learning, there is a lot to benefit from collaboration across regions. That is EGAD and ECOWAS coming together to not just learn from each other, but to begin to be innovative in terms of how to respond to the changing context, both regionally and internally within the various member states.
Well, thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
I'm going to proceed to the last two questions. So, how are foreign powers like Gulf State, China, Turkey, and the US shaping the political and security trajectories of the Horn of Africa?
Well, they are. And they are doing this in pursuit of their geopolitical interests. And
Only their geopolitical interests?
Geopolitical and economic interests, if I may add, and even cultural interests, because it's basically about influence. It's about influence, it's about extracting resources, it's about coming under spheres of influence. So they are, in every member state of the Horn, these countries are actively engaging. Not just in the what I call the strategic, political, and economic, but actually in terms of peace and security. They are directly involved. So the fundamental question to raise is, whose security should really matter? Is it the security and strategic and economic interests of these people coming from outside?
Or is
it
yes,
that of those people in the Horn? And that is a question that only the people and the governments of the Horn of Africa have to answer. And they would then have what I call engagement with these multiple forces from outside on EGAD and the Horn's own terms, rather than making themselves kind of follow what is being dictated to or brought from outside. But it requires the Horn of Africa being able to generate the kind of resources, innovative ideologies, instruments, and mechanisms to enable it to this.
Well, this is a bonus question. Okay. How does climate change intersect with human security and political stability in the Horn of Africa, starting from water stress to displacement?
Thank you very much. I think that what climate change is doing, and I will talk of the extreme weather conditions. Let's just focus on that.
That would be lovely.
Let's not talk about the rising, the extreme weather conditions, whether it's in terms of prolonged drought or desertification, or whether it's in form of its impact on livelihoods and the ecosystems, is that it ties into this whole question about resources. So it's very well established in the literature that when resources shrink, competition over those resources intensify and fuel violent conflict. And in an environment with the history and the kind of complex transitions that you have in the Horn, it actually complicates violence, and that's insecurity, threat to life, and so on and so forth. What it then means is that with climate change and some of the response to it not keeping up with the extent to which it is shrinking resources and provoking even greater violence, what happens is that with the intensification of violence, there is what you call environmental displacement. With violent conflict also comes displacement. With displacement comes tensions between the internally displaced and host communities. And when this takes place in border regions, it then translates into refugeeism and migration, with its further complications for migration to other countries and migration even as far as Southern Europe. So the implications are so wide. The ramifications are really huge. So what can we do about climate change? Is Africa able to do things about climate change without the support and collaboration of the other regions of the world? Does Africa have the capacity or the resources to procure the technologies that will mitigate the disastrous impact of climate change on ecosystems and livelihoods? Where will this come from? So these are the broader issues that may not be within our immediate control, but we do know that there are policies, mechanisms, and architectures for mitigating the impact of climate change on this region. They may not be going far enough, but it calls for more research and the political will to implement those things that will mitigate the impact of climate change on resources, and devise through what I call innovative technologies that will produce drought-resistant variants of particular crops, what I call social protection programs for the most vulnerable and for people most impacted by the effects of climate change on ecosystems, geographies, as well as people's livelihoods. So it's a whole lot of things that have to be done, but we all have to collectively recognize that this is not a problem of one small community, one country, but of the entire region, and beyond the Horn, the entire continent.
Well, that is a really good answer. Well, Dr. Obi, this is like a reflection, and what gives Dr. Obi hope for the region?
What gives me hope for the region is its people. Africa is blessed with young, innovative, brilliant people. And a continent's wealth is not so much about the amount of oil and gold and forests and the abundance of natural resources. It's about the human spirit, their capacities, their ability to dream and to find solutions. And that is where Africa has an advantage. Its people, their sheer brilliance, energy, and faith that they can actually find solutions. All that needs to be done is to cement and harness all those energies together to find a way out. Every problem has a solution, and it's usually a human solution. So our people, under the right circumstances and conditions, can and have demonstrated in the past that they have the ability to overcome their problems and challenges.
Yeah, and following that part, do you have any advice for early career African researchers in peace and security?
Advice. That's a tough one. But I would say that for early career researchers in African peace and security, I think the first thing they need to do is to touch base with local realities and to think beyond existing paradigms and theories, not to be afraid to theorize Africa's challenges from African perspectives, to be able to touch base with the vast wealth of our traditional wisdoms legacies and histories, and to be able to creatively and innovatively think of how to come up with the knowledge that will shed light on the problems that we face, and to have that uncanny ability to connect that to the actual actions, policies, and decisions that will solve those problems. So not to give up at all, but to keep working and to keep dreaming and to keep challenging conventional wisdoms to come up with fresh ideas and fresh solutions.
Well, that is all the question that I have for you, and we're very honored to have you here, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed our interaction.